Donna Vekic laughed at Alex Eala during warm-up, and by midnight, the entire Filipino internet had seen it. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a misquote buried in a post-match presser. This happened on the grass courts of Berlin, in broad daylight, in front of cameras that never stop rolling. A warm-up, a glance, a smile that lasted maybe 2 seconds. And yet those 2 seconds detonated something that had been building for months. A tension between respect and recognition, between a rising star and a world that still wasn't sure how seriously to take her. Because here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Alex Eala had already beaten Donna Vekic, twice, in the same calendar year. And when the player who lost twice turns up on the same court and laughs, you have to stop and ask yourself, who is actually nervous here? That question is what this whole story is really about. And by the time we get to the end of it, you might look at that 2-second smile very differently. To understand why that warm-up moment hit the way it did, you have to go back to January, back to Auckland, back to a match that most tennis analysts quietly predicted would be a routine first-round exit for a young Filipina still finding her footing on the WTA Tour. Alex Eala walked onto the court at the 2026 ASB Classic as a 20-year-old with something to prove. Donna Vekic walked on as an Olympian, a Paris silver medalist, a Wimbledon semi-finalist, a player who had beaten Coco Gauff, beaten Aryna Sabalenka, beaten some of the most decorated names in the sport, the kind of player whose resume makes younger opponents tighten up before the first ball is even struck. Nobody gave Eala a serious chance. And then the match began. Eala dropped the first set, 4-6. It looked for a moment like the script was writing itself the way everyone expected. The experienced Croatian was going to be too much, too steady, too powerful, too decorated. But tennis has always been a game that rewards the player who refuses to read the script, and Alex Eala had clearly never been given that particular memo. She came back, 6-4 in the second, 6-4 in the third. Nearly 3 hours of tennis under the Auckland sun, with a crowd of Filipino fans roaring so loudly that Eala herself said afterward it never felt like she was playing away from home. Home is about the people and not the place, she said in her on-court interview, and the crowd lost itself completely. Donna Vekic, a player who had beaten world number 2s, walked off that court stunned. But here is where the story gets interesting, because Eala and Vekic met again, just 8 days later, Kooyong Classic, Melbourne, Eala's final warm-up before the Australian Open. And this time there was no 3-set drama, no dropped opening set. Eala won in straight sets, 6-3, 6-4, clinical, composed, almost ruthless. 2 matches, 2 wins. And a message sent so clearly that even the most casual observer could read it. Eala was no longer just a name on a draw sheet. She was a problem. And by the time June arrived, by the time the grass court season swung into full gear and Berlin appeared on the schedule, Eala had added something else to her resume, a title at the Lexus Birmingham Open, her most significant WTA win to date. She arrived in Berlin not as a wildcard hoping to survive. She arrived as a wildcard who had already beaten this opponent twice and had a trophy less than 2 weeks old. Donna Vekic arrived with her own momentum. She had just won the HSBC Championships in London, beating Emma Raducanu in the final. She was playing some of the best grass court tennis of her career. She was hungry for revenge. She had circled this match. You could feel it. 2 players, 2 very different stories. Same court. And before a single point was played, something happened that changed everything. Here is what we know for certain. Alex Eala and Donna Vekic took to the court for their pre-match warm-up at the Berlin Grass Court Championships on the morning of June 15th. This is standard. Routine. Players hit, they feel the surface, they calibrate their timing before the match begins. Most warm-ups are invisible, forgettable rituals that nobody records, nobody analyzes, and nobody talks about. This one was different. Midway through the warm-up, as Eala struck a ball wide, a simple error, the kind that happens 100 times in any warm-up session, meaningless, throwaway, Donna Vekic glanced across the net, and she smiled, a small, private smile. The kind that flickers and disappears so fast you might almost convince yourself you imagined it. Except several cameras were rolling, and several Filipino fans in the crowd were watching, and in 2026, nothing is invisible. Within minutes, clips began circulating. The angle varied depending on the camera. Some showed it clearly, some caught only the tail end, but the consensus reading among the Filipino fans who saw it was unanimous and immediate. Vekic had laughed at Eala, not with her, not at the situation, at her. Now, was that the reality? We will come back to that question, because the truth of a 2-second expression is almost always more complicated than the story it gets folded into. But in the moment, in the raw, unfiltered, emotionally charged atmosphere of a match between a Croatian veteran seeking revenge and a Filipino rising star with everything to prove, that smile became a weapon. Not because Vekic necessarily intended it that way, but because sport is as much about perception as it is about reality, and perception had already made its decision. What made it land harder was the context. This was not just any match. This was their third encounter. Eala had won the first two. If you have lost to someone twice and you walk into a warm-up smiling at their errors, the story writes itself. Veterans use the warm-up. They use their body language. They use every available tool to establish psychological control before the first serve is struck. Eala would have known that. Her team would have known that. And when she saw that smile, if she saw it, not a single muscle in her face moved. She bent down, she picked up another ball, she served again. That composure, that stillness, was its own kind of answer. But the crowd had already carried the moment somewhere else entirely. And what happened next was something no WTA press officer had a protocol for. If you have never witnessed Filipino sports fandom in full eruption, there is genuinely nothing in global sports culture that quite prepares you for it. By the time the match had finished its warm-up and the coin toss was underway, the clip had already crossed 100,000 views. Filipino Twitter, still one of the most active sports commentary communities on the planet, had identified the moment frame by frame. Fan accounts that had been tracking Eala's career since her junior days were quote-tweeting the clip, with captions that ranged from measured disappointment to absolute fury. The hashtag moved fast. Demands for a WTA investigation emerged within hours, not from fringe voices, but from prominent fan accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers, who framed this as part of a larger pattern. Was Eala being disrespected by the tour's establishment players? Was the warm-up incident just the most visible symptom of something quieter, something systemic, that a young Asian player faces when she starts winning matches she was never supposed to win? Comments flooded YouTube channels covering the Berlin draw. Instagram posts about the match were buried under Filipino fans demanding answers. Philippine sports journalists who had been following Eala's career began weighing in, some carefully, some not carefully at all. The story had left the tennis court and entered the much louder, much less nuanced arena of social media justice. And underneath every comment, every thread, every heated exchange, there was something real, something worth paying attention to. Filipino fans had watched their player be underestimated again and again by a tour that barely knew her name 12 months ago. They had watched her pull off a comeback in Auckland that most commentators treated as a surprise rather than a confirmation of genuine ability. They had watched her winning Kooyong, win in Birmingham, climb the rankings to number 33 in the world, and still feel like she was fighting for recognition that other players simply received. So when they saw what looked like dismissal in that warm-up smile, they didn't just react to a 2-second expression. They reacted to everything, every underestimation, every time a commentator mispronounced her name, every time her wins were qualified with surprising or unexpected, rather than simply celebrated. That is the thing about a single moment that catches fire. It is never really just the moment. It is everything the moment reminds people of. And right now, millions of people were reminded of all of it. But stop. Before this story becomes something it isn't, before Donna Vekic becomes a cartoon villain in a narrative that is far more complicated than that, we have to be honest about who she actually is. Because here is a piece of information that changes the texture of this story entirely. Donna Vekic is not a stranger to the Philippines. She is not indifferent to Filipino fans. In fact, earlier in 2026, Vekic played the inaugural WTA 125 Philippine Women's Open, a tournament held on Filipino soil, in front of a Filipino crowd that had every reason to cheer against her, and she reached the final. And during that tournament, she earned something that Croatian tennis players rarely earn in Southeast Asia. She earned genuine affection from Philippine fans who watched her compete with class and warmth. She signed autographs, she acknowledged the crowd, she smiled at the cameras outside the venue and waved to fans who had waited hours to see their first live WTA tennis. She was, by multiple accounts, one of the most gracious players at that event. That is not the biography of someone who disrespects Asian players. That is the biography of someone who, in a completely different context, was celebrated by the very fans now calling for her investigation. And when you factor in the mechanics of what actually happened in that warm-up, the brevity of the expression, the fact that warm-up errors are laughed off constantly in professional tennis, the fact that Vekic was under genuine pressure entering this match as a 2-time loser to the same opponent, a different interpretation becomes possible. Maybe she was nervous. Maybe that smile was self-directed, the kind of involuntary, barely conscious expression a competitive athlete produces when their own tension peaks and has nowhere else to go. Maybe she was smiling at herself, at the pressure of the moment, at the strange circularity of facing the same player for a 3rd time in 6 months. Or maybe she was doing exactly what veterans do, attempting to project ease, project confidence, project the kind of unshakable calm that says, I have been here before and this does not frighten me. None of that makes the Filipino reaction wrong. Perception is real. The feeling of dismissal is real even when dismissal wasn't the intent.
But the fuller picture of Donna Vekic, the athlete, the competitor, the woman who charmed an entire Manila crowd, doesn't belong to the villain's chair. The truth, as it almost always is in sport, lived somewhere more complicated than either side wanted to admit.
Was this disrespect? Was it gamesmanship? Or was it simply the moment a rivalry became too real for either player or either fan base to stay calm about? Drop your answer in the comments because this conversation is just getting started. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't do surface level. We go deeper. We find the moments inside the moments. Hit subscribe because the next story we're telling is going to hit even harder than this one.